The hospital at night has its own eerie heartbeat, a pulse of silence interrupted by the whispers of the unseen. But what I encountered beneath its surface was beyond anything I could explain or forget. I worked in the radiology department of a hospital in Cardiff, Wales, for about 3 years as an admin and clerical officer. Over time, I saw some shocking things, from patients passing away in MRI scanners to bizarre cases like a man needing an X-ray after inserting a meat thermometer into his urethra. Nights were always the wildest shifts. I'll never forget the time a patient arrived with armed police after a city center knife fight, only to get into another altercation with his injured rival right in front of me. Chairs and trash bins went flying, and even a wheelchair became a projectile. Night shifts started at 7 p.m. and ran until 8:30 a.m. We'd do 3 in a row, followed by 4 days off. By the end of the 3rd shift, you'd be ready to hibernate. This story, though, happened on my first night of the rotation, so I was wide awake. The shift began uneventfully. I took over from the day staff, logged into my PC, and prepared for a long, quiet night. During downtime, we'd stream shows or movies to pass the hours. That night, I was watching One Piece. The first few hours flew by uneventfully until it was time for my break. The hospital was a maze, the largest in Wales and a teaching institution with a long history. The quickest way to get anywhere was through the tunnels beneath it, a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors, abandoned rooms, and unsettling, decrepit spaces. These tunnels were also home to the morgue, making them far from comforting, even during the day. Rumors swirled about the tunnels. Staff spoke of ghostly porters in old-fashioned uniforms and shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. One story even described a violent encounter with an apparition in a 1970s nurse's uniform. Despite these tales, I'd never experienced anything paranormal myself until that night. At around 1 a.m., I decided to take my break in the multi-faith chapel on the 5th floor, known as the Sanctuary. To get there, I had to pass through the tunnels. Scanning my key card, I entered the tunnels and started walking. 2 minutes in, I felt it like someone was following me. In a busy hospital, it wouldn't have been unusual, so I ignored it. Then, I heard panting, as though someone had been running. I turned around, but no one was there. I brushed it off as old pipes creaking or some other mundane noise. But as I continued, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Distracted, I missed the turn toward the elevators and found myself in a part of the tunnels I'd never been to before. The corridors were lined with ancient, abandoned hospital equipment, rusting stretchers, broken beds, and decaying wheelchairs. Dust and dampness filled the air, adding to the suffocating atmosphere. That's when I realized I was lost. Panic set in as the sensation of being watched became almost unbearable. My chest tightened as I turned corners, desperately searching for a way out. Suddenly, I felt a heavy blow to my arm, as if someone had struck me with a bat. I fell, crawling to the nearest wall for support, my heart racing. Then I saw it. 20 meters ahead, a black mist hovered in the corridor. It had glowing red eyes, fixed on me. Was this the entity stalking me? I didn't wait to find out. I scrambled to my feet and ran as fast as I could, taking random turns until, by some miracle, I stumbled upon a janitor. He took one look at my pale face and asked, "Did you see it too?" I never stepped foot in those tunnels again. To this day, I wonder what I encountered and why the janitor seemed to know about it. Maybe it was stress or exhaustion. Maybe it wasn't real. But one thing is certain, I have no intention of finding out. When you work night shifts at a care home, you expect quiet halls and sleeping residents. But when the spirits decide to join in, quiet turns into anything but calm. I work nights at a care home in the UK. Over the years, I've witnessed some eerie, ghostly encounters that have left me utterly spooked. It started when I worked evening shifts. I often heard footsteps behind me when I was alone, and eventually things escalated. I began feeling invisible hands scratching or tapping my head. At first, I brushed it off, thinking I was imagining things. Later, I switched to night shifts. That's when things became far more intense. There's one spirit all the night staff knows about, a figure we call the Shadow Man. He lingers in corners, watching people. He doesn't get too close to me, but he has a strange habit of getting uncomfortably close to one of my coworkers. One night I was walking down a staircase that faced a corridor leading to a dead end. From the corner of my eye, I saw a figure. She was almost glowing, a bright white apparition with straggly hair and no face. She peeped out of a bathroom doorway, her head and upper body slightly visible. Even without a face, it felt like she was watching me. I turned to call my coworker, but when I glanced back, she was gone. She didn't seem malicious, just there, observing. I haven't seen her since. The Shadow Man, on the other hand, feels different. He's darker, lurking. One night, a coworker and I were cleaning the corridor near the living rooms. We started venting about work issues, and as if on cue, all the living rooms began making loud, unsettling noises at once. I yelled, "Be quiet," and everything stopped. But when we started ranting again, the noises resumed. Then my coworker froze, staring at me. "The Shadow Man is behind you," she whispered. I didn't dare turn around. Another strange incident happened when I heard a man yelling, "Help me," in the corridor. But when I checked, no men were around. All the residents were women, and they were asleep. On another occasion, I was walking to the kitchen when the cutlery started clanging loudly on its own. I ran out so fast and refused to go back there after dark. One of the scariest moments happened while I was assisting a resident. My coworker and I suddenly heard banging noises, loud and frantic. At first, she didn't hear it, so I thought I was imagining things. But when the banging grew louder, she finally noticed it too. We decided to leave the room and check the source of the noise. As we walked past the bathroom, where I had previously seen the glowing woman, the door slammed shut and began shaking violently. We were terrified. All the doors in the care home are alarmed to ensure residents stay safe, and none of them were triggered. No one was awake, and no resident could have done it. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened in that bathroom. On another night, while doing hourly check-ins, my coworker and I heard a woman's voice crying, help me," over and over. Thinking it was a resident, we rushed to check the rooms, but everyone was sound asleep. The voice continued, echoing through the halls, and neither of us recognized it. The spirits here seem to thrive on scaring us. I've heard whistling, seen chairs move in the corner of my eye, and even had my name whispered in my ear while I was sitting alone in the staff room. Despite everything, the Shadow Man remains the most unnerving presence. I left the care home temporarily 3 months ago, but I can return any time. Honestly, I don't know if I ever will. The thought of those restless spirits keeps me away. Working the night shift at a museum filled with relics of the past might sound peaceful, but when the exhibits seem to have a life of their own, the lines between history and horror blur in ways you'd never expect. I work as a security officer, and 2 years ago I was assigned to patrol and protect a large museum in Hesse, Germany. At first I thought the job was perfect. I could explore all the exhibitions without crowds while earning money. Day shifts and late shifts were always enjoyable, ensuring everyone left, blasting music over the announcement system and just soaking in the history. But then there were the night shifts. I've always had a knack for noticing strange things. A good friend of mine, who later became part of this story, calls it the third eye. That gift made the night shifts anything but ordinary. One of the first eerie discoveries my buddy and I made was what we called the mumbling head. It was in a pitch-black maintenance walkway near the roof. We never dared shine a flashlight into the void where the sound came from. It sounded like a man mumbling, mostly incoherent, but occasionally forming words. The things he said weren't ominous, just random chatter. Still, the darkness made it chilling. The museum's most unnerving area, however, was called the treasure chamber. This room housed some of the most valuable items in the collection. One night, while doing my rounds, I felt unusually tired. As I scanned the checkpoint badge in the chamber, something caught my eye near a particular painting. It looked like invisible tendrils were writhing in the air around it. I froze, unsure of what I was seeing. My instincts screamed at me to back away, so I did step by step, without turning around until I reached the elevator. Back at the security center, my coworker immediately noticed my pale face. "What happened to you?" he asked. When I told him about the painting, his expression changed. He went white as a sheet. "You saw it too," he whispered. He explained that something similar had happened to him. While walking past the same painting, he felt a firm hand grip his shoulder, even though no one else was there. We agreed then and there we'd avoid the treasure chamber as much as possible. That wasn't the only strange thing about the museum. Alarms in certain rooms would go off randomly at night, despite being repaired multiple times. The announcement system sometimes played pre-recorded messages at 3 a.m., even when no one triggered them. And throughout the entire building, there was an overwhelming feeling of being watched. I finished that night shift without further incident, but the museum never felt the same to me again. The treasure chamber still haunts my thoughts. Were those tendrils something supernatural? Or was it just my imagination, amplified by the eerie silence of the night? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain: some parts of history are better left undisturbed. Old English pubs are known for their charm, history, and sometimes even their ghosts. But when a prank turns into an encounter with something unexplainable, the joke's on you. I worked at an old pub for about a year. It dated back to the 1700s, and like many old English pubs, it had a reputation for being haunted. At first I thought it was just a bit of fun, something to entertain the staff and locals. But then, things happened that I couldn't ignore. One night, my colleague and I decided to prank another coworker. She was easily spooked, so we thought it would be funny to mess with her while she was turning off the TVs for the night. There were 6 TVs spread across multiple rooms. As she turned each one off, I followed behind her, secretly switching them back on. After she finished, she noticed the TVs were all on again and became visibly nervous. My colleague asked her to turn them off one more time. She was genuinely scared at this point, so we revealed our prank and had a good laugh about it. After we closed up, I went downstairs to the staff area to grab my things. The staff area was located below the main pub, near the customer toilets, the stockroom, and the cellar doors. To get there, you had to walk down narrow corridors with thick stone walls and low ceilings. It was always a little eerie, but that night it felt different. As I walked through the corridor, I could hear shuffling noises, voices, and footsteps echoing around me. I assumed it was my 2 colleagues who had come down before me, but when I checked the staff room, it was empty. I froze. I double-checked the manager's office and even peeked into the stockroom, but there was no one there. The sounds I had heard were so clear it was impossible to mistake them for anything else. I didn't play any ghost pranks after that night. Later in my time there, I learned how to change the beer barrels stored in the cellar. My manager took me down for the first time to show me how it was done. As we stood near the customer toilets, she gave me the key code to the cellar door. Suddenly, a memory from my very first shift came rushing back. I had been sent to the staff area for the first time, and as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I bumped into a man exiting the cellar. He was older, large, with a long beard and a big coat. He looked a bit like a vagrant. At the time, I had no idea this cellar was a staff-only area. I apologized for nearly bumping into him, but he didn't acknowledge me and simply walked past. I hadn't thought much of it since. Curious, I mentioned this encounter to my manager and asked if it was possible for customers to access the cellar. Her reaction surprised me. She was initially annoyed that I hadn't reported a possible intruder, but after I explained it was my first day and I didn't know the layout, she listened more closely. When I described the man, she went pale. "That sounds exactly like the ghost the previous owners used to talk about," she said. Apparently, the pub was said to be haunted by the spirit of a man who frequented the cellar. I had never seen him again after that first day, and I'm not sure if I ever want to. By the time I left the pub, I had experienced enough to believe there might be more to the old stories than just rumors. Working the night shift at a domestic violence shelter is intense enough, but when unexplained footsteps, voices, and flying chairs join the mix, the real question becomes who or what is watching. I work in a domestic violence shelter, covering the 2:30 p.m. to midnight shift. Recently, I took on an overnight shift from midnight to 10:30 a.m. It didn't take long for strange things to start happening. During my overnight shifts, I'd often see people walking around from my office window, which faces the women's living area. At first, I thought it was just the other staff on duty, but I quickly realized it wasn't them. The only other person working the shift with me would usually be asleep, and the only resident we had at the time was wheelchair-bound. We do hourly walkthroughs at night to ensure everything remains locked and secure. The shelter has strict access protocols. Doors to the main areas like the women's and men's wings can only be opened with a staff key fob. Despite this, I'd hear footsteps and see shadows moving where no one should be. Every time I went to investigate, I found nothing. One night during my regular shift, I went to the bathroom in the admin area, which is in the back of the building behind two locked doors. The hallways there are brightly lit with high-powered white LED lights, so it's usually very clear and open. While I was in the bathroom, I heard footsteps echoing through the halls. I knew it wasn't my coworker, as the doors have an intercom alert that sounds whenever they open. When I stepped out of the bathroom, a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I pride myself on being logical and level-headed, so this feeling caught me off guard. It was as though something invisible was watching me, something radiating bad energy. I ran back to the office, where my coworker was sitting calmly. When I told her what happened, she wasn't surprised. "This kind of thing happens all the time here," she said. Apparently, the shelter has a long history of strange occurrences. People frequently hear knocking late at night, often from empty rooms. Female voices have been reported coming from the men's wing, which is on the opposite side of the building and separated by locked doors. On one particular night, my coworker and I decided to check out a hallway in the women's wing that's notorious for its eerie energy. As we walked down the hall, A sign that had been securely pinned to the wall since September suddenly fell right before we reached it. Moments later, a door in the hallway creaked open. No one was back there. Our only resident wasn't in that part of the building, and all other staff had left hours earlier. We checked every room, but nothing was out of place. Another night, while walking through the halls, I heard loud knocking, footsteps, and movement. Each time I turned to look, nothing was there. Once I even heard a chair crash to the ground in an empty room. The most unsettling moment happened when my coworker and I were walking down the same notorious hallway. One of the doors started shaking violently, as though someone on the other side was trying to break through. We froze in terror. All the doors are alarmed and no residents were awake at the time. There was no logical explanation for what we witnessed. These events have left me questioning what exactly is going on in the shelter. I'm not quick to label things as paranormal, but sometimes the unexplainable is impossible to ignore. What if the walls around you started moving, paintings came alive, and reality itself began to unravel? Stay with me as I share the story of a man whose descent into the unknown turned his quiet night shifts into a living nightmare. I'm currently on sick leave, and my therapist has recommended I try cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT). According to the National Health Services, CBT is a talking or writing therapy that helps people manage problems by changing how they think and behave. It's commonly used to treat anxiety and depression, but can also help with other mental and physical health issues. Right now, I'm dealing with serious mental health problems, which all started in the summer of 2021. I hold a degree in sports science and physiotherapy from John Moores University in Liverpool. Like many, my career was derailed when gyms and sports venues took a massive hit during the pandemic. By late last year, I was reapplying for jobs in my field, but my ongoing struggles have made maintaining professionalism almost impossible. As a result, I ended up on sick leave, working as a night porter at a budget hotel. Let me be clear, there's nothing wrong with night shifts, porter jobs, or overnight security work. Work is work, and anyone supporting themselves or a family deserves respect. But for me, transitioning from a dream career to being alone in an old Georgian townhouse felt soul-crushing. I've always been a social person, playing sports, talking about sports in bars with friends or strangers, so being forced into isolation affected me deeply. The loneliness was overwhelming, but that's not why I'm sharing this. You're here for scary stories, and what happened to me, what's still happening, has been the most terrifying experience of my life. It started during one of my night shifts. The hotel, built in 1820, but renovated to modern standards, was eerily quiet. Keycard locks, sleek elevators, and fast Wi-Fi made it comfortable, but the emptiness gnawed at me. I spent hours alone, with little to distract me aside from patrol duties and the occasional indulgence in YouTube videos. The boredom was suffocating. Then, one night, something impossible happened. As I walked through the dim hallways, I saw a spot on the wall begin to bubble and froth, as if alive. My first instinct was to rub my eyes, thinking I was seeing things. But when I looked again, the bubbling continued before finally subsiding. My heart raced. Was it my eyes? My mind? I neglected my patrol duties for the next half hour, spiraling down an internet rabbit hole of mental health conditions: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. Each possibility terrified me more than the last. Desperate for answers, I called my doctor, but due to the pandemic, in-person visits weren't an option. The receptionist scheduled a phone consultation, but I had to wait 2 agonizing days. I prayed the hallucinations wouldn't return, but they did, this time worse. There's an old painting in one of the hallways, a simple scene of two people walking in a Parisian park with the Eiffel Tower in the background. It's the kind of artwork you barely notice. Yet that night, as I walked past, something felt wrong. I froze. The figures in the painting shimmered just like the bubbling wall. And then, though I swear the painting didn't move, I felt them watching me. Panic set in. My chest tightened as the figures in the painting dissolved into a grotesque tangle of limbs, faces, and teeth. I ran to the porter's office, slammed the door, and collapsed in the corner, shaking. That was my first panic attack. I felt utterly broken, terrified that I was losing my mind. When my doctor finally called, the words, "You're having a normal reaction to an abnormal situation," felt like a lifeline. The prescribed medication began to help, but the fear lingers. Recovery is slow, and I'm still on sick leave, rebuilding myself piece by piece. To anyone listening, let my story be a reminder mental health struggles can happen to anyone. But with help, things can get better. Story 7. What would you do if the dead seemed to stir? Not in a horror movie, but in the quiet halls of a science museum. This chilling true story of a night gone wrong will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the unseen world. This story isn't directly about my night shifts, but it involves a particularly unsettling encounter with someone who worked for the company monitoring the nighttime security systems of the institution that used to employ me. I held the position of executive director at a large science museum on the eastern seaboard. At one point, we hosted a human cadaver exhibit, similar to the famous Body Worlds exhibition in Houston, Texas. For those unfamiliar, donating your body to medical science isn't the only way to recycle your remains. Some individuals volunteer to be displayed in museums or educational institutions for public education. While classroom skeletons are typically made of plastic these days, real ones do exist, thanks to the generosity of such individuals. Yes, it's morbid, but it's also fascinating, and these exhibits tend to attract large crowds. Ours was no exception, generating significant revenue for the museum. However, the exhibit stands out in my memory for an entirely different reason, a reason that chills me to this day. One night, in the middle of the exhibit's run, I received a call from the security company monitoring the museum after hours. It was just after 1:30 a.m., and as part of my job overseeing museum security, I was the one on call for emergencies. While groggy, I answered the phone and moved to my laptop to access the museum's remote CCTV feed. Most of the time, these calls were false alarms. A door sensor might trip or a camera might malfunction. But that night, the voice on the other end of the line told me something that jolted me awake. The motion sensors in the human cadaver exhibit had detected movement. Mixed emotions washed over me. On one hand, I was surprised. A science museum isn't exactly a prime target for burglars, despite the value of some of our equipment. On the other hand, I was concerned. Why would anyone want to break into an exhibit filled with preserved human bodies? As I logged into the camera feed, I asked the security officer where exactly the sensors were going off. His response sent a shiver down my spine. The movement was coming from inside the cadaver exhibit. I brought up the camera feed, expecting to see some kind of intruder, but the room was empty. The only figures in sight were the preserved bodies, standing, sitting, or kneeling in their display cases, perfectly still. I asked the security officer if he was absolutely sure the motion sensors were functioning properly. He assured me, albeit with a shaky voice, that the sensors were not prone to malfunction. If they were faulty, they would simply stop working, not give false readings. We watched the camera feed in tense silence for 10 to 15 minutes. The exhibit remained eerily quiet, yet the motion sensors continued to trigger. Then, the officer's voice broke the silence. The sensors just went off again. Where I asked, my heart racing. All of them, he replied. I had no choice but to drive to the museum. The idea of walking through the cadaver exhibit in the dead of night was terrifying, but I had to ensure there were no actual intruders. When I arrived, the building was completely silent. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. I unlocked the doors and stepped inside, the echo of my footsteps magnified in the empty halls. As I entered the exhibit, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. The preserved bodies stood motionless in their cases, their lifeless eyes staring into nothingness. I inspected every corner of the room, every display case, and every shadow. There was no sign of any disturbance or intrusion. Yet, the memory of those motion sensors repeatedly triggering haunted me. It was as if something unseen had been moving among the dead. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened that night. The museum remained secure, and the motion sensors never malfunctioned again during the rest of the exhibit's run. But I'll never forget the fear that gripped me as I walked through that room, feeling as though I wasn't entirely alone. What drives someone to play God with life and death? This is the chilling true story of a trusted medical professional who turned into a cold-blooded killer, earning the dark nickname the Angel of Death. Stick around, the twist will leave you speechless. South Efren Saldivar was born on September 30th, 1969, in Brownsville, Texas. Shortly after his birth, his father moved the family to Los Angeles, California, in search of work as a handyman. Efren's mother worked as a tailor and raised her children as devout Jehovah's Witnesses, emphasizing the importance of earning a place in paradise through good works. However, Efren's later actions would suggest he was destined for something far darker. In junior high school, Efren struggled academically. Though popular with teaching staff, he failed to fit into any social group. His large stature made him self-conscious, and his awkwardness left him unable to approach girls he liked. Instead, he developed deep obsessions and wrote them unsettling, intimate notes that only creeped them out. By the end of high school, Efren had no clear goals. He considered college and the military but acted on neither. When he told his father he couldn't work well with others, his father suggested he start his own business. While Efren liked the idea, his fear of rejection held him back. Instead, he worked at a supermarket, where his sociopathic tendencies began to emerge. He stole from the store and his co-workers, justifying it as leveling the playing field since his poor social skills disadvantaged him. After failing his senior year, Efren felt directionless, fueling a brooding anger. Then he met an old acquaintance wearing a nursing uniform. This person spoke highly of their studies at the College of Medical and Dental Careers in North Hollywood, describing the field as financially and spiritually rewarding. Jealous but intrigued, Efren decided to follow suit. He passed a high school equivalency test, enrolled in technical school in 1988, and earned a certification within a year. He soon secured a job close to home, transforming from a rudderless young man to a uniformed, upwardly mobile professional. Efren's job as a respiratory therapist at Glendale Adventist Medical Center involved crucial responsibilities. He monitored patients' breathing, inserted breathing tubes, and adjusted ventilators. Though the job was demanding, he poured himself into it, impressing even doctors with his extensive knowledge of drugs and equipment. However, his colleagues had no idea that Efren was hiding a sinister side. Working night shifts gave Efren unsupervised access to patients, a situation he exploited. He was responsible for checking on patients without drawing attention, giving him the perfect cover for his crimes. Over time, staff noticed an unusual pattern: patients under Efren's care often died unexpectedly. On February 26, 1997, patient Jean Coyle pressed her call button, and Efren responded. Her last memory of that night was blacking out. Unbeknownst to her, she had been injected with something by Efren. Though she survived, others were not so fortunate. A colleague grew suspicious after observing Efren's behavior and reported him. The accusation? Efren was injecting patients with something that led to unexplained deaths. However, there was no proof, so the hospital couldn't fire him. Soon after, co-workers broke into Efren's locker as a prank and found a bag of powerful narcotics, including Pavilon, a drug that paralyzes muscles, including those used for breathing. Despite this, they couldn't report their findings without risking their own jobs for the illegal search. The breakthrough came when a nurse mentioned Efren's suspicious activities to a man named Grant Brassis. Brassis, hoping for a reward, reported Efren to the hospital, which then alerted the police. Detective John McKillop of Robbery Homicide took the case. While compiling evidence, 2 more patients died under Efren's care. This escalation prompted McKillop to arrange a polygraph test for Efren, during which the respiratory therapist made a chilling confession. Efren admitted to killing an elderly cancer patient early in his career by suffocating her. He then confessed to injecting Pavilon into another patient, effectively paralyzing them and causing death by suffocation. Over 2 hours, Efren described injecting multiple patients on different nights, claiming he felt sorry for them and believed they were ready to die. When asked how many people he'd killed, he estimated less than 50, though the number could have been higher. Despite his confession, Efren was released after 48 hours due to a lack of physical evidence. The police's focus shifted to obtaining proof, which led to the exhumation of several patients' bodies. Tissue samples revealed significant amounts of Pavilon, confirming Efren's crimes. Efren was arrested in January 2001 and charged with 6 counts of murder. During his trial, he admitted to killing up to 60 patients but claimed he had lost count. He described how he would look at patient lists and decide, "Who do we have to get rid of?" Efren eventually pleaded guilty to 6 murders to avoid the death penalty. In March 2002, Judge Lance Eda sentenced him to 6 consecutive life terms. Efren offered an apology, saying he was truly sorry and asking for forgiveness, though none of the victims' families accepted his words. In a final twist of irony, had Efren been sentenced to death, he would have been executed using the very drug he once used to kill his patients: Pavilon. How could a simple smile lead to a horrifying tragedy? This shocking true story will reveal how a moment of kindness turned into an unimaginable nightmare. In the early hours of December 9, 2020, Marta Elena Vento, a 27-year-old Spanish migrant worker, was manning the reception desk at the Bournemouth branch of the budget hotel chain, Travelodge, in southern England. Marta had moved to the UK in February of that year, initially working at a recruitment center before securing a better paid position at the hotel. Part of her increased pay came from occasionally working night shifts, which were both exhausting and isolating. However, Marta didn't complain. Employment opportunities in England were far better than in her native Spain, and the salaries were significantly higher. Despite the challenges, Marta was optimistic about her decision to move, an optimism that, tragically, would not last. That fateful morning, a man named Stephen Richard Cole entered the hotel's reception area. Just days earlier, Stephen had been kicked out of the Russell Court Hotel, another budget accommodation, after a violent altercation with two fellow guests. On December 7th, he checked into Marta's Travelodge branch. Hotel staff later described Stephen's behavior as increasingly strange and alarming. He became agitated about the smoke detectors in his room, claiming they weren't fire alarms but devices to monitor his brainwaves. Some reports say Stephen hammered his fists against his fourth-floor window, shouting for help as if he were being held captive. Members of Stephen's family had already contacted his doctor, urgently requesting antipsychotic medication. Stephen had thrown away his previous prescription, stating that the medication made him feel numb and zombie-like. Without it, his mental health had sharply deteriorated, culminating in a full-blown breakdown by the time he arrived at the Travelodge. It's unclear why Stephen carried hair clippers that night. Psychologists suggest that individuals in the grip of a breakdown often shave their hair as a symbolic act, a way to purify themselves or start anew. Perhaps it was paranoia, a belief that altering his appearance would help him escape imagined threats. Whatever the reason, Stephen carried those clippers with him when he stepped out of the elevator and walked toward the reception desk. Marta, hearing the elevator doors open, likely looked up to greet the late-night guest. As always, she wore a warm smile. Her cheerful demeanor had won over countless guests during her time at the hotel. But to Stephen, her smile was not a gesture of welcome. He saw mockery. He saw her laughing at him, taunting him. In his delusional state, her smile became a provocation. What happened next was a senseless act of violence. Stephen charged at Marta, attacking her with the hair clippers. The first blow struck her head, knocking her to the ground. Marta tried to crawl away, but Stephen didn't stop. He kicked and stomped on her repeatedly, driving her into a small alcove behind the reception desk. Trapped and unable to escape, Marta endured a prolonged, brutal assault. CCTV footage showed the horrifying scene. Stephen, half bald from a self-inflicted haircut, continued his attack for 42 agonizing minutes. By the time he finally stopped, Marta's lifeless body lay in a pool of blood. The reception area was spattered with it on the desk, the walls, and the floor. Witnesses later described the scene as resembling an abattoir. Marta's injuries were so severe that one guest vomited upon discovering her body. After the attack, Stephen paced the lobby, appearing to grapple with what he'd done. He eventually returned to his room, washed the blood from his hands, and then went back to the lobby. This time he avoided looking at the reception desk. Finally, he left the hotel and walked to the nearest police station. At the station, Stephen approached the front desk and calmly confessed. "I've just killed someone in a hotel," he said. "I think she worked there. I haven't slept in 6 days." At first, the officers thought it was a sick joke. Stephen showed them traces of blood still under his fingernails. Realizing the gravity of his confession, they arrested him and placed him in a holding cell. Meanwhile, officers were dispatched to the hotel, where they confirmed Stephen's horrific crime. Investigators soon learned that Stephen had a history of violence and mental health issues. He had been released from prison just 2 months earlier, following convictions for 3 incidents of indecent exposure. He also had a prior charge of battery against his own mother. His family had repeatedly sought help for his mental illness, but systemic failures had left him untreated. In court, Stephen's defense attorney described his severe schizophrenia. He had experienced persecutory delusions, auditory hallucinations, and disorganized thinking. The judge acknowledged that Stephen's illness impaired his judgment and self-control, but emphasized the brutality of his actions. Marta had been relentlessly beaten, with no one to save her. Stephen was detained under the UK's Mental Health Act and placed in a secure psychiatric facility. The case highlighted tragic flaws in the mental health system. If Stephen had received adequate treatment, could Marta's death have been prevented? Perhaps. But for Marta Elena Vento, a hard-working young woman with dreams of a better future, those failures cost her everything. Sometimes, a routine traffic stop can take a deadly turn, revealing the unimaginable. What started as a simple check for a tired driver became a night I'll never forget, and neither will you. Working for the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police for 8 years, I'd only ever fired my gun once. Many officers might call that lucky, but my one shooting is a story that overshadows all others. It wasn't routine, it was pure circumstance, and it still haunts me. One night, after wrapping up a call at a 7-Eleven on East Owens Avenue, I was driving back toward the Strip. As I approached a traffic light on James Street, I noticed something unusual. A car was parked halfway on the sidewalk with its interior lights on. The driver was slumped over in his seat, his posture unnatural. With no pressing calls, I decided to check it out. Circling the block, I rolled up slowly beside the car. Sure enough, the man inside was unconscious. After a quick check around the vehicle for weapons or drugs, I tapped on his window. He startled awake, blinking in confusion. "Oh my God, officer, I'm so sorry," he stammered. "This is my house right here." I must have nodded off after pulling over. The man, Hispanic in his late 30s, was dressed in work clothes. He explained that he worked long shifts at a chemical plant in Henderson and had been awake for nearly 24 hours straight. Exhaustion had finally caught up with him. His story seemed plausible. His eyes were bloodshot, and his speech groggy but not slurred. He didn't smell of alcohol, and his ID checked out. Yet, something about him felt off. When I asked which plant he worked at, he said Olin chloralkali. That didn't sit right. My cousin worked in the same industrial park, and I knew Borman Chemical was the only plant running night shifts at the time. A small lie. Innocent enough, or so it seemed. But lies, no matter how small, always raise suspicion. I decided to dig deeper. Returning to his car, I asked him to step out for a quick sobriety check. "No problem, officer," he said, but there was hesitation. His arm, which had been resting on the open window, suddenly disappeared below the door frame, out of my sight. That's a big no-no during a traffic stop. People don't reach where officers can't see unless they're hiding or grabbing something. My instincts kicked in. Hand on my firearm, I stepped closer. "Keep your hands where I can see them," I said firmly. He raised both hands, but as we spoke, they began to drift. I pinned his left arm to the car door. "It's fine," he insisted. "I'm just unlocking the door." "Use your other hand," I snapped. Then I saw the gun. Tucked behind his back, he grabbed it in a flash. He fired. One shot hit my left arm, sending searing pain through me, but my training took over. I dropped out of his line of fire, drew my weapon, and returned fire through the rear passenger window. My shots hit their marked center mass. As the chaos settled, I radioed for backup, my left arm useless and my mind racing. Somehow, despite the pain and adrenaline, I stayed alert. The man slumped forward, weakly murmuring, "Why'd you shoot me?" "This is my house." As if he hadn't just opened fire on me moments before. It was surreal. People often deny their actions, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Maybe it's fear, maybe it's shock, but his words stuck with me, even as paramedics arrived and whisked me away. Later, they found nothing in his car but a single bottle of OxyContin. No prior criminal record, no warrants, just a man hooked on painkillers, desperate to keep them. He'd rather risk death than face detox in jail. The whole ordeal was senseless. With no priors and a good lawyer, he could have walked away with probation or a reduced sentence. But addiction warps the mind, making fear overpower reason. I survived that night, but I often think about how close it came to ending differently. Addiction doesn't just destroy lives, it claims them in the most unexpected ways.